Welcome, listeners, to our podcast centering around the international relations topic of the rise of populism. We're your hosts, Hella,
And his name.
And Ingrid.
and today we delve into a topic that has dominated political landscapes worldwide, the rise of populism. Joining us today
Is Professor Arnd Jurgensen, who is an expert in political science with deep understanding of this global phenomena. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. So let's start with the basics. Populism has been on the rise across various countries in recent years. Could you help our listeners understand what exactly populism is from what your understanding is and maybe why it has gained so much traction?
Well, populism is a term that has a fairly long history that is probably somewhat different than its current incarnation. It was the reference to the kind of left-leaning governments in Latin America in the 1950s and 60s. And at that point in particular referred to a kind of a coalition in places like Argentina as specifically in relation to the government of Juan Perón. Who was Mr. Perón himself was from a military background. His social background was middle class. He was close to the Argentine industrialists, meaning middle class in the more Marxist sense of the bourgeoisie. But who recruited for his project of modernizing Argentine society support from the working class, and was in that sense a kind of a coalition between a kind of a rather odd coalition between the industrial class of industrial entrepreneurs and the industrial working class. And part of that worked in the context of Argentina, in large part because a large part of Juan Perón's program was to increase the domestic market in order to realize economies of scale that would allow for the success of industrial projects. And in that regard, it became a kind of a reference to cross-class analyses, cross-class alliances of that nature, and tended to be associated not so much with the political left, but rather with the political right. As later developments in Argentina and the history of Juan Perón's subsequent policies seem to indicate. In its current incarnation in Western Europe and North America, in some ways it has similar kinds of features in that it relates to people like Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, who was one of the more recent leaders that kind of fits that description, and of course certainly Donald Trump. And in both the figures of Silvio Berlusconi and Donald Trump, we see a similar kind of dynamic insofar as both are entrepreneurs, if not industrialists, in other words, very wealthy individuals. Both of them have a kind of popular appeal based on a kind of a strongman kind of image, and both appeal primarily to the working class. And do so not so much from a left-wing perspective as their socialist and communist counterparts, but from a more right-wing perspective. And obviously, this understanding of populism also has some similarities with 1930s style fascism.
Fascinating. Now let's dig a little bit deeper. So populism seems to take forms in different countries. Could you maybe shed some light on the variations of populism and how they manifest across diverse political contexts?
Well, one important component of that, I would say, and again, I have to emphasize that my expertise is more in relation to Latin American politics and U.S. politics and international relations than the study specifically of populism in various different contexts. But as is the case with all political movements, they take different forms in different circumstances. And one interesting component in that regard is that they are all mobilizations in the context of democracy of the working class for the election of these kinds of leaders that I just described. They are generally perceived, however, to be somewhat how should I say this? Mixed in their support for democratic institutions, and this is again something that's fairly evident in the context of the United States and Donald Trump, given the experience of January 6th. But that tied to more right-wing understandings, in particular the lack of emphasis on political rights and liberalism, has made them in almost all contexts somewhat on the more authoritarian end of the spectrum in terms of politics, and has in different kinds of contexts resulted in institutions that measure the effectiveness of democracy, suggesting that the rise to power of these kinds of movements is a form of democratic backsliding toward authoritarianism. That has taken different forms in different countries. One place that comes to mind in this regard is Turkey under Erdogan, who also fits that kind of a description, and who to a considerable extent undermined various aspects of the democratic institutions in Turkey, and has been perceived as more of an authoritarian leader. The fact that he's still standing for elections and that he came close to losing elections in the last elections nonetheless demonstrates a commitment to democracy, or at least to nominal aspects of democracy in the context of Turkey. Um, we would have to see what his reaction would have been had he lost that election, and whether it would have been somewhat similar to Donald Trump's. Donald Trump's outright rejection of the legitimacy of electoral institutions in the United States is, in that sense, a somewhat more extreme form. The other names that, of course, come to mind are Mr. Orban in Hungary, who still governs within the democratic institutions within his country, but again has been accused of, to some extent, undermining the effectiveness of those democratic institutions. And of course, that also, to a certain extent, puts these movements in a similar kind of a light as somebody that is not considered at this point to govern under democratic institutions, which is Vladimir Putin in Russia.
That's a great point. You talked about Erdogan in Turkey. So just based on that, I have a question that like, what factors do you think contribute to the appeal of populist rhetoric? And why do some people feel drawn towards these movements? Like we know that oftentimes these authoritarian leaders, like they tend to undermine constitutional principles. Like we've seen like in Pakistan, where the populist leader Imran Khan, he's kind of doing the same thing, and like populist leaders have tend to have this tendency to like gain the support, all of it for themselves, and like be the law instead of respecting the constitution. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, again, that's a very complicated question and would have to depend to a certain extent on the different contexts in which we look at it. If we are talking about Turkey, I think that one of the flaws in Turkish democracy has always been that Turkey is a very divided society, that large segments of Turkey are very conservative and very religious. And that Turkey has, since its emergence as a modern state at the end of the Second World War, pursued a sort of a militantly secular approach to politics, partly as part of the project of becoming Europeanized, becoming part of the European Union, and so on and so forth. What that basically meant is that Kemalist approach to politics excluded or left out a large segment of the Turkish population in terms of its influence on government, and that became an opportunity for Mr. Erdogan to mobilize his electoral base on the basis of that kind of more religious support among conservatives in Turkey. The fact that this same segment of the population also felt to a large extent economically left out of that overall project further contributed to that. I think that similar dynamics, although obviously in a very different context, are evident in the rise of Donald Trump in the United States. It's in that context, it's the Christian right that certainly feels as though it has not had the kind of influence over the mainstream politics of certainly the Democratic Party, but even to some extent the Republican Party. And in that regard, it is that sort of disaffected segment and largely inactive segment of the population that was activated in the case of Erdogan in Turkey, and that quite clearly became more active in politics as a result of the entrance of Donald Trump into the Republican Party, and has, to a considerable extent, transformed the Republican Party. It's in that sense very interesting to note. And I don't know whether there's a exact equivalent to that in the case of Erdogan, who more or less started his own political movement. But when Donald Trump entered the race for the Republican Party in 2016, 2015, I guess it was, um, the response of almost every Republican that was on those debating stage was anyone but Donald. In other words, he was not seen as a member of the Republican Party. And in fact, during much of his previous decades, had been more closely associated with Democrats in New York than with Republicans per se. So in that regard, he was an outsider, and again mobilized a kind of a segment of the American population had felt to a large extent left out of political discussions. In the United States, it had a religious element in terms of the Christian right that jumped to support Donald Trump. But perhaps more importantly, I think it's that overlap between that segment of the population that was left out, those parts of the country that in the United States are referred as flyover country, and not all that far removed from that, um, the white working class that had seen itself likewise abandoned by the pro-business and pro-trade policies of both the Democrats and the Republicans in the previous 2 decades.
Yeah, so like following up what you just said, we know that it's clear that populism has had a significant impact on political landscapes, not only in Latin America, but globally. What do you consider could be like some consequences of like this rise of populism, and how do these movements may impact like democracy and maybe social cohesion?
Well, in the case of Latin America, the original populist regimes were those like that of Goulart in Brazil and Perón in Argentina. And they were relatively short-lived, and in both cases, they gave rise to an authoritarian backlash and dictatorship. We can only hope that the countries that are currently under more populist leadership in Western Europe and the United States, where it is anything but certain that Donald Trump will not be elected. Sorry, that's a weird double negative, where it is relatively possible that Donald Trump might be reelected, that these countries having a far longer democratic or history of democratic institutions will be more resilient in being able to resist the tendency to challenge democratic institutions that is evident in populist movements. Again, this takes different forms in different contexts. In the context of Turkey, it was the secular nature of the state and of the constitution in Turkey that was slowly whittled away by the more explicitly Islamist movement of Erdogan. And in that sense, kind of undermined the basis of the democratic institutions that had existed in Turkey for quite some time. In the context of the United States, it will no doubt take somewhat different forms and already has begun to take different forms. What does seem to be quite clear is that these populist movements do not have a great deal of respect for the idea of the rule of law, which I think is a key component of liberal approaches to politics, and has been largely seen as whether focused on religious rights, on gay rights, on workers' rights, and so on and so forth, as problematic to these populist kinds of leaderships. And in that regard, certainly what we're seeing in the impact of Donald Trump's appointments to the Supreme Court in the United States seems to signify that undermining to a certain extent of the functioning of democratic institutions.
That's a great point, Professor. Thank you. Hala, would you like to add something?
I just wanted to thank you for your time, Professor, and for your wise insight. I really benefited from this little interaction, and I feel like I now understand populism to a greater extent. So thank you, and thank you, listeners, for tuning into our podcast. We hope this conversation has provided you with a deeper understanding of populism, just as it has with me, and its impact on societies worldwide. Until next time, stay curious and keep seeking knowledge. Bye, everyone.